All right, go ahead.
Hel- Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Walsh, and I'm an environmental or level artist, as well as a landscape photographer. In the bottom left corner, there is a link to my portfolio site. I would greatly appreciate it if you took a look at that when we are done here. Let's get started. Let's start with my influences. My first major influence is Satoru Takezawa. He is an art director at Nintendo who's worked there since roughly 1995, and he's worked on multiple high profile games, mostly along the Legend of Zelda series, and most recently in Breath of the Wild. His oversight of the environmental design of Breath of the Wild specifically has been a major influence on pretty much all of my works. My next influence is a little bit cliche, but I often find myself looking to nature and the world around me for inspiration and reference. And I try to document that through photography as best I can. This inevitably influences my 3D works as well, almost more so than Breath of the Wild's influence was. Speaking of my 3D works, let's take a look at those now. My first true series of works was my Papercraft series. This was inspired off of the environmental design of the more recent Paper Mario games, as well as various forms of papercraft. Each work in the series was themed off of a specific color. In the case of this piece, the color blue. As I worked on this series, I wanted to add more complexity and more visual elements in order to better flesh out the world that I was creating. This would eventually culminate in the final render of the series, Pink Forest. Even though all of these environments were clearly fake, I wanted them to feel alive, to feel like a living, breathing world. From here, I drastically altered how I created my landscapes. Before, I would create a single scene for a single render. But after the crafted environments, I wanted to create much larger worlds that I could diversify the regions of and place many more assets in and gather anywhere from 20 to 40 renders sometimes. My first attempt at this was my Industrial Wasteland series. I have a short animation that gives a good flyby of the entire environment. I wanted to create a more visually realistic world, so I worked to make the textures more realistic looking. And I also wanted to introduce some level of storytelling using only visual clues, as is evident by the fact that this is in a wasteland and the giant metal structures, the vast fields of rubble and twisted metal, and the broken skyscrapers scattered around. There is a story behind this environment, but I want to leave that to your own imagination rather than spell it out. My next series is my cloud platform series. I wanted to take a more painterly approach to this series, so I hand painted the vast majority of the textures. And I also wanted to theme it off of an change in appearance between daytime and nighttime. In the daytime, I wanted to focus on warm autumn colors. This gives a good overview of the scene during the daytime. I hand sculpted the entire terrain from every river channel to every lake basin, and I'm especially proud of how the cascading waterfalls connecting the two turned out. In the daytime, I focused on warm autumn colors, but at nighttime, I wanted to flip it on its head and change the focus on cool colors instead. I wanted to use lighting to both enhance the colors of the scene as well as to illuminate it. This is a nighttime scene, and as important as darkness is to this scene, you also need to be able to see it. Next up is my Toonland series. I wanted to experiment with cell shading in this series. For anyone unaware, cell shading is an art style where instead of having a gradient between areas of light and shadow on objects, there is instead a hard transition or several hard transitions between the two. To achieve this, I wanted to use minimal texturing while pushing the color further. I also created the terrain via a new method this time. I opted to create the entire terrain by extruding it edge by edge, and this gave me far more control over both the size of the terrain as well as the level of detail in it. I had to pay close attention to the lighting for every render, as the smallest adjustment in the lighting would also have a drastic impact on the piece due to the cel shaded nature. I wanted to create a visually interesting environment without using complex textures to do so. So, what I opted to do instead was fill the environment with certain interesting areas, such as ruins, forest, and waterfalls. Anything that would make an interesting set piece for a render and make the environment feel more alive, make someone want to explore around it. My next series is also my most recent and easily my largest to date, my volcanic slope series. I wanted to push myself as well as the software I was using in this series, so I created a massive environment and wanted it to be diverse. The idea is that it's centered around a volcanic caldera in the middle that is actively erupting and spewing lava, and on its slopes are a variety of different biomes, from an ash dune area to a snowy taiga to a forest with the occasional flower patch in it, even to a valley with glacial boulders strewn about. I wanted to use color in this piece to make certain areas pop in contrast to the darker hued backgrounds. Let's move on to my photography now. As I stated before, most of my landscape photos will either directly or indirectly influence my 3D works in some way. And I think it's important for any landscape artist to have some knowledge of real world environments. And preferably, it would be best if they documented and had real world experience with those environments. I use photography for my documentation. The photos on the last slide, as well as on this current one, were taken on a trip to the Smoky Mountains a few summers back. I have a tradition with my family of taking summer vacations to various places around the country, such as Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, Smoky Mountains. And recently, this has become less of a vacation and more of an opportunity to collect some reference photos from different regions that, let's just say, you wouldn't find in southern Arkansas. Unfortunately, due to certain circumstances recently, let's call it, I haven't been able to do this recently, but I look forward to resuming this tradition in the future. After taking a photo like this, I'll usually take it into Photoshop to see if I can push the lighting and color just a bit further. I also have an interest in plant and flora photos. I think it's important to document the smaller details of an environment in order to have a better understanding of how to flesh out any sort of 3D environment I've made once the basics are already in place. Close up photos like this make for excellent reference. On a side note, this specific photo, Insect Paradise, was accepted into the Happy Distraction virtual exhibition in Little Rock over the summer. Aside from light and color, I'll usually play around with the visuals themselves and see if I can make them work for my advantage as well. A good example of this is luminance here. This was taken at an aquarium in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and the specks that you see scattered around the image were actually just bits of dust on the glass of the aquarium. But I noticed the lighting was interacting with them in an interesting way. So I was able to take this photo into Photoshop and adjust it just a little bit, and what resulted was an image of jellyfish floating in what looked like a sea of stars. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you all for coming out today and listening. And are there any questions?